So everybody in the first century is conceding the tomb is empty. The real question is, how did it get empty?
Today, we'll hear how an investigative journalist with a degree from Yale Law School overcame his doubts about Jesus Christ by spending 2 years studying the events of his life, especially the resurrection. Our guest is Lee Strobel, and the evidence that he uncovered regarding Jesus' death and resurrection are really fascinating, and he'll include some non-religious sources as well. Lee is the author of over 40 books, including the best-selling Case for Christ series. Here's Lee Strobel speaking to our staff on today's Focus on the Family.
I'm just going to tell you a story. It's a true story. It's my story. And it's a story that began in atheism. Because I decided at a rather young age that God does not and cannot exist. I mean, I just thought the mere concept of an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the universe, come on, it's crazy. Wasn't even worth my time to check out. I thought that God didn't create people, but people created God. Why? Because they were afraid of death. So they made up this idea of heaven and an afterlife to make themselves feel better about dying. That's what I thought. Now, granted, I tend to be a skeptical person. My background's in journalism and law. Can imagine you put those two things together, what kind of a skeptic that you get. I was the legal editor of the Chicago Tribune newspaper, and we used to pride ourselves on our skepticism. We wouldn't accept anybody's word at face value. We always tried to get at least 2 sources to confirm a fact before we print it in the newspaper. So no kidding, we had a sign in our newsroom that said, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Maybe she's lying. You got any evidence to back that up? Got any proof? And that's okay. You want journalists to be skeptical. Don't you wish sometimes they were more skeptical than they are? But my problem was that my skepticism bubbled over into cynicism, and it cemented me into my atheism. Now, because I had no belief in God, I really lacked a moral framework for my life. Now, I'm not saying all atheists are like this. I'm just saying, look, I tend to be logical. I tend to be rational. So I'm thinking, okay, if there is no God, if there is no heaven, if there is no hell, if there is no judgment, if there is no ultimate accountability, then the most logical way for me to live my life would be as a hedonist, someone who just pursued pleasure. And that's what I did. So I lived a very immoral and drunken and profane and narcissistic, self-absorbed, really in a lot of ways self-destructive kind of life. That was my life. What people saw was me winning awards for investigative reporting. What they didn't see was the other side, which was me literally drunk in the snow in an alley on Saturday night. I had so much rage inside, and if you asked me back then, what's the deal? Why the anger? Why the rage? I couldn't have told you. But looking back, I can see what it was. I was always after that perfect high. You know, I was always after that ultimate experience of pleasure. But guess what? Everything let me down. Nothing lived up to the hype. So a lot of anger, a lot of rage. I remember once my wife and I got in an argument, and our little daughter was there, and I had so much rage, I just blew up. And I remember I reared back, and I kicked a hole right through our living room wall. And my wife's crying, and our daughter's crying. It's like, hey, it's just another day in the Strobel house. In fact, I'm going to tell you the ugliest thing about me, which was when my little daughter, Allison, was just a toddler. If she was alone in the living room playing with some toys, some blocks or whatever, and she would hear me come home from work through the front door, her natural reaction was just to gather her toys and go in her room and shut the door. She gonna be drunk again? She gonna be yelling and screaming and kicking holes in the walls? You know what? At least it's nice and quiet in here. Friends, that is the ugliest truth about me. My wife, Leslie, was agnostic. She didn't know what to think about spiritual stuff. And so one day, if you saw the movie that they made on our life, you know that she met a woman who was a Christian, and she was a nurse. And they became best friends. And this woman, Linda, shared Jesus with my wife. She invited her to church. She answered her questions. And then, after many months of Leslie checking it out, she came up to me and gave me the worst news that any atheist husband could get. She said, "I've decided to become a follower of Jesus Christ." I thought, oh, great, here it comes. Going to turn into some holy roller or something. I didn't sign up for this. This wasn't part of the deal. First word that went through my mind, divorce. I was going to walk out. But then I thought, well, wait a minute. What if I could rescue her from this cult that she's gotten involved in? It's not that hard, because even I, as an atheist, recognize that the entire foundation of Christianity rests on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Even I recognize that. And I thought, how hard can it be to disprove that? Right? Why is the resurrection foundational? Because Jesus, in a variety of different ways, made transcendent and messianic and divine claims about himself. He claimed to be the Son of God. But so what? I could claim to be the Son of God. Jim Daly, well, maybe not Jim. Yeah. Anybody could claim to be the Son of God. But if Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, died, and then 3 days later rose from the dead, that's pretty good evidence he's telling the truth, right? That's why, the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 17, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You're still in your sins, right? That's the ball game. So I thought about the fact that Easter is coming up when we remember the resurrection of Jesus. And I thought, you know what? Why don't I outline for you 4 words that begin with the letter E. Now, I want you to remember that when I was a skeptic, when I was an atheist, I did not consider the New Testament to be inspired, inerrant, the Word of God. I do now, but I was a skeptic then. But I had to accept it for what it undeniably is, which is a set of ancient historical writings. And so I knew, just as you can investigate any ancient writing, whether it's by Suetonius or Tacitus or it doesn't matter. You can take those same investigative techniques and apply them to the pages of the New Testament to try to determine, is it telling me the truth? So that's what I set out to do. So what are the 4 words that begin with the letter E that summarize the evidence for the resurrection? Because Easter begins with E, right? So what are the 4 words that begin with E that summarize the evidence? The first E stands for the word execution. You have to have a death first, right, before you can have a resurrection. And what I learned is there's virtually no dispute among scholars in the world about the fact that Jesus was truly dead after being crucified. Why? Well, first of all, we have no evidence anywhere in history of anyone ever surviving a full Roman crucifixion. In fact, no less of a source than the Journal of the American Medical Association, a secular, scientific, peer-reviewed medical journal, carried an investigation into the death of Jesus. And I'll recite to you one sentence they wrote that summarized their conclusion. They said, quote, clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted. I mean, this is so well established of an historical fact that Jesus was truly dead. You would get laughed out of a major academic institution if you came in and said, no, I think he somehow survived the crucifixion. Because, most of the facts that we accept as being true from the ancient world are based on one source, or maybe 2 sources. And yet, for the conviction that Jesus was dead after being crucified, we not only have multiple first-century sources in the documents of the New Testament, we've also got 5 ancient sources outside the Bible confirming and corroborating his death. We have Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian who worked for the Romans, Tacitus, another early historian, Meribar and Serapion, Lucian. Even the Jewish Talmud admits that Jesus was dead. How strong is this? Let's go to an atheist New Testament scholar like Gerd Ludemann of Vanderbilt University, and he'll tell you this, quote, Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. Now, I don't know how much you studied ancient history, But there are very few facts of ancient history that a skeptical, critical, atheist historian like a Gerd Ludemann will say is indisputable. One of those facts is the death of Jesus on the cross. The first E is for execution. Jesus was dead. The second E is the most fascinating. It stands for the word early. We have early accounts or early reports that Jesus rose from the dead. In other words, reports that come virtually immediately after his death. Why is that important? Because I used to think, like a lot of skeptics, that the resurrection was a legend. And I knew it took time for legend to develop in the ancient world, so I figured 100, 150 years after the death of Jesus, stories were invented, mythologies were spun, legends were invented, and that's where the idea of the resurrection came from. But what I learned decimates the claim that the resurrection is merely a legend. Follow me on this. I think this is fascinating. We have preserved for us a creed of the earliest church. The very first Christians, right there in the very first century, used to rally around this creedal statement based on facts that they knew to be true. Now, this creed contains the essence of Christianity. It says Jesus died. Why? For our sins. He was buried. On the third day, he rose from the dead. And then it mentions the specific names of eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses to whom he appeared, including 500 people at once. Now, what's important about this eyewitness-based creed of the church with named eyewitnesses, named groups of eyewitnesses, is how immediately it developed in the ancient world. Because remember, we said it takes time for legend to develop? We can date this creed. How? Because the Apostle Paul preserved it for us. He wrote a letter to the church in Corinth. We call it 1 Corinthians. And in that letter, which he wrote about 22 to 25 years after the death of Jesus, he includes this creed. We find it in 1 Corinthians 15, starting at verse 3. And so he includes it, but he includes it in a way to suggest, by the way, I've already given you this on a previous visit. I'm just reminding you of this, which means that sometime within, say, 20 years of the death of Jesus, this creed was already in existence, and he had given it to the church in Corinth. But we can go back even earlier. How? Well, we know that Paul used to be Saul of Tarsus, a persecutor of Christians. 1 to 3 years after the death of Jesus, he's on the road to Damascus. Boom, he has this encounter with the risen Christ. He becomes the Apostle Paul. Immediately, he goes into Damascus, and what does he do? He meets with some apostles. There are many scholars who are convinced this is when those apostles gave him this creed that he later wrote in the letter. But others are more skeptical. They say maybe it was 3 years later. 3 years later, Paul goes to Jerusalem, and he meets for 15 days with 2 eyewitnesses to the resurrection who are named in the creed, Peter and James. They're named as eyewitnesses in the creed. They get together, and Paul describes this meeting in Galatians. He uses a Greek word, hysterio, which suggests that this is an investigative meeting that they had. They weren't talking about the Super Bowl. They weren't talking about the weather. They were talking about how do you know, what you see, what you experience. Many scholars believe this is maybe when Paul was given the creed by the 2 people named in the creed. But either way, this means 1 to 6 years after the death of Jesus, this creed is already in existence. Therefore, the beliefs that make up that creed go back even earlier, virtually to the cross itself. Friends, there is no huge time gap between the death of Jesus and the later development of a legend that he rose from the dead. We got a news flash. It goes right back to the beginning. In fact, one of the greatest scholars in this area is James D.G. Dunn. He said this. He said, this creed, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as a creed within months of the death of Jesus. Within months. Friends, this is historical gold. Historians drool over this. So it's formulated within months. That means the beliefs that make up the creed go back even earlier. It's incredible. So we don't have some huge time gap. In fact, one of the greatest historians who ever lived was A.N. Sherman White of Oxford. He studied the rate at which legend developed in the ancient world. And he determined that the passage of 2 generations of time is not even enough for legend to grow up. and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. We don't have 2 generations of time passing here. We got a news flash, goes right back to the beginning. It would be unprecedented in the history of the world for a legend to develop that fast and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. And that's not the only early report we've got. We've got others in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts, all of which date back so early. They were circulating during the lifetimes of Jesus' contemporaries, who would have been all too happy to point out the errors if they were making this stuff up. Friends, we got an execution. Jesus was dead. We have a report of his resurrection that's so early, so immediate, you can't write it off as being a legend. But that's not all we've got. We've got a third word that begins with the letter E, and that is the word empty. We have an empty tomb. The historical record tells us that Jesus' body was placed in a tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea, member of the Jewish council. It's sealed. Matthew tells us it's guarded, and yet it's discovered empty that first Easter morning. Now, I used to think I was smarter than all that. I used to think, whoa, wait a minute. I'll tell you why the tomb was empty. The body was never in it in the first place. Don't you know that part of the horror of crucifixion is they would throw your body to the dogs? It was illegal under Roman law to bury execution victims. That's what I thought, until I got disproven by a little thing called archaeology. And guess what archaeologists discovered? The bodies of a couple of crucifixion victims from the first century who were buried. In fact, one of them, named Johann, still had the spike driven through his heel bone and a piece of the olive wood of the cross still attached. So we know that there was some burial of crucifixion victims. In fact, I interviewed a great scholar in this area, Dr. Craig Evans. And Dr. Evans said to me, quote, "I conclude that the burial of the body of Jesus in a known tomb, according to Jewish law and custom, is highly probable." So there went my idea that the tomb was never occupied. Roman law did allow for the burial of certain execution victims. But the tomb is discovered empty. How did it get empty? That's the interesting question. You know, when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen, what the opponents of Jesus never said was, "Baloney, go open the tomb, you'll find the body." What did they say instead? Disciples, Jesus had risen. Enemies of Jesus, oh, well, the disciples stole the body. Now think about that. That's a cover story. They're admitting the tomb is empty. They're trying to explain how it got empty. You see what I'm saying? It's like if you're a teacher and a student comes up to you and says, "The dog ate my homework." That student's admitting, "Look, I don't have my homework, but I can explain what happened to it. The dog ate it." It's the same thing. So everybody in the first century is conceding the tomb is empty. The real question is, how did it get empty? And you go through the usual list of suspects. The Romans weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus dead. The Jewish leaders of the day weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus to stay dead. The disciples weren't about to steal the body. Why? So they could live lives of deprivation and suffering as a result of their proclamation. We have 7 ancient sources, 6 of them outside the Bible, that confirm that the disciples lived lives of deprivation and suffering as a result of their proclamation that Jesus had risen. Why were they willing to do that? Nobody knowingly and willingly dies for a lie. Why were they willing? You know why? Because of the fourth word that begins with the letter E, which is the word eyewitnesses. Not only was Jesus' tomb discovered empty, but over a period of time, Jesus appears alive in a dozen different instances to more than 515 people. To skeptics and doubters, as well as to believers. To men, to women, indoors, outdoors, daytime, nighttime. People talked with them, they touched them, they ate with them. Think of this. Remember we said earlier, we're lucky in ancient history if we have one source to confirm a fact, or maybe if we're lucky, we get 2 sources to confirm a fact. Well, get this. For the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources, inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the risen Jesus. Friends, that is no less than an avalanche of historical data. Now, I have a book I did called In Defense of Jesus where I spell out all of these sources. I'm going to go through them real quickly just so you'll know what they are. First source is the creed that I mentioned. A creed, by the way, whose historical credentials are so strong that one of the few Jewish New Testament scholars, Pinchas Lapid, said, quote, "It may be taken as a statement of eyewitnesses." The second source is the Apostle Paul. Paul, after he became a Christian, got to know some of the disciples. He knew Peter, he knew James, and he knew John. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 11, regarding the resurrection, "Whether it is I or they, this is what we preach." In other words, we're saying the same thing, that Jesus has come back from the dead. That's the second source. The third source is the book of Acts. Now, even skeptical atheist scholars will admit that the book of Acts contains summaries of the preaching of the earliest church. And guess what the topic was of the preaching of the earliest church? It was the resurrection of Jesus. In Acts chapter 2, Peter gets up before a group and he says, "Men of Israel, listen to these words. This Jesus, a man attested to you by miracles and wonders and signs, which he did in your midst." You know that he did. He appealed to their common knowledge. And then he said, "This Jesus, God has raised from the dead, to which we're all witnesses." We're all witnesses to the resurrected Jesus. And how did they respond? Did they say, "Peter, you're drunk. You don't know what you're talking about"? No. 3,000 people said, "Peter, we know that's the truth. What do we do?" They repented and the church was born. So first source, the creed. Second, Paul's testimony. Third, the book of Acts and Peter saying we're all eyewitnesses. And then the next four sources are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels. And in the Gospels, we find no fewer than 9 appearances by the resurrected Jesus. The Gospels are classified by scholars as being ancient biographies intended to report what actually took place. Let me read to you the conclusion of Dr. Craig Evans, who's written like 40 books on the historical evidence for the resurrection and other topics, professor at Houston Christian University. This is what he said. He told me, he said, "Lee, there's every reason to conclude that the Gospels have fairly and accurately reported the essential elements in Jesus' teachings, life, death, and resurrection. They're early enough. They're rooted into the right streams that go back to Jesus and the original people. There's continuity. There's proximity. There's verification of certain distinct points with archaeology and other documents." And then he said, "There's the inner logic." So there we have 7 total sources, but there's 2 more outside the Bible. Let me ask you a question. If you were to come to work here at Focus on the Family and work here for, say, 3 years, do you think you'd have a pretty good idea of what Jim Daly believes? Yeah, I think you would. Well, we have writings preserved from people who sat under the teachings of the very disciples themselves, the eyewitnesses to the resurrection. Some of them wrote letters and reported what they were told by these eyewitnesses. So 2 of those sources, one of them is Clement. Clement was ordained by Peter himself. And he actually wrote a letter to the church in Corinth, again in the 1st century, where he said the apostles had, quote, "complete certainty caused by the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ." So he's confirming that they're eyewitnesses to the resurrection. And then Polycarp, he was appointed by John to be the bishop at Smyrna. He wrote a letter to the Philippians. He mentions the resurrection no fewer than 5 times. And in this letter, he said, referring to Paul and the other apostles, he said, quote, "For they did not love this present age, but him who died for our benefit and for our sake was raised by God." So here are 9 ancient sources, inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus. That is an now, is that just convincing to an evangelical Christian? Let's go back to the atheist New Testament scholar, Gerd Ludemann of Vanderbilt University. Based on this kind of evidence, this is what he was compelled to concede, quote, "It may be taken as historically certain, not a possibility, not a likelihood. It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. I couldn't have said it better myself. So don't you wonder, why is he still an atheist? You know why? He found the loophole. There's a loophole that explains all this away. You know what it is? The disciples didn't really encounter the resurrected Jesus. They merely had hallucinations. There you go. That kind of explains it all away, right? Well, wait a minute. I'm a journalist. I check things out. So I sought out one of the leading psychologists in the world, an expert on the human mind, someone who had written 40 books on psychology, someone who was a professor of psychology for 20 years at a major Midwestern university, somebody who was the president of a national association of psychologists. And I sat him in a chair and I said, now, Dr. Collins, would you not admit to me, these disciples didn't encounter the resurrected Jesus, they merely had hallucinations. And he looked at me and he said, that is not possible. I said, what do you mean? You seem pretty sure of yourself. He said, I am. I said, why? He said, Lee, you have to understand something about the nature of hallucinations. Hallucinations happen in individual minds. They're like dreams. They don't spread like the common cold. You can't wake up your spouse in the middle of the night and say, honey, wake up. I'm having a great dream about a vacation in Maui. Let's both go back to sleep. We'll have the same dream. We'll save all the airfare. We'll save all the hotel costs. Wouldn't you like to be able to do that? Here's a question. Why can't you do that? Because dreams happen in individual minds, just like hallucinations. And then he looked at me and said, Lee, you said that the earliest report, the most reliable historical report you have, tells you that Jesus, as risen Christ, appeared to 500 people at once. I said, that's right. He said, Lee, 500 people having the same hallucination at the same time will be a bigger miracle than the resurrection itself. And then he added this. He said, by the way, if this were just hallucinations, the body would still be in the tomb, right? Oops, the body's gone. Friends, these were not hallucinations. It wasn't something more subtle like a vision where they missed Jesus so much that they imagined, Peter, don't you see him there in the shadows? You know, that they talked themselves into seeing something that wasn't there. I don't think so. Not when Saul of Tarsus was a persecutor of Christians. He was not psychologically primed to have a vision of the resurrected Jesus. James, a half-brother of Jesus, who did not believe in Jesus during his lifetime, who was all taught his entire life there's one resurrection at the end of time. Nobody's coming back in the interim. And yet he died as a martyr of the church. Why? Because Jesus appeared to him. Friends, these weren't hallucinations. They weren't visions. They weren't mythology or legend or make-believe. These were actual encounters that the disciples had with the resurrected Jesus that transformed their lives. Friends, I spent 2 years of my life investigating this kind of evidence. And it all came down to a Sunday afternoon. And I went alone in my room and I sat down with all the documents and books and evidence I'd accumulated over these 2 years. And I said to myself, you know, a good juror reaches a verdict. So I reviewed it all one more time, and then I stepped back and I said, wait a minute. In light of this avalanche of evidence that points so powerfully toward the truth of Christianity, I realized it would take more faith to maintain my atheism than to become a Christian. Like the scales went like that. And that's when I reached my verdict in the case for Christ. That based on the historical data, I was convinced that Jesus didn't just claim that he was the Son of God, he backed it up by returning from the dead. And then I thought, am I done? Is that it? Do I just go back to my life? Is that, what do you do? And then my wife pointed out a verse to me, John 1:12. It says, but as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. And I said, now I get it. That verse forms an equation of what it means to become a child of God. Believe, plus receive equals become. So I said, okay, I get it. I believe, based on the data of history, Jesus is the unique Son of God. He proved it by returning from the dead, but that's not enough. I had to receive. Receive what? Receive the free gift of forgiveness and eternal life that Jesus purchased for me on the cross when he died as my substitute to pay for all of my sin. And when I would receive this free gift of his grace, then I would become a child of God. So I got on my knees. And I poured out a confession of a lifetime of immorality that would absolutely curl your hair. And at that moment, I received complete and total forgiveness through Jesus Christ, and I became a child of God. And my wife burst into tears, and she ran over and threw her arms around my neck, and she was weeping, and she said, I almost gave up on you 1,000 times. She said, when I was a new Christian, I met some women at church, and I told them about you. I said, I don't have any hope for my husband. He is the hard-headed, hard-hearted legal editor of the Chicago Tribune. He's never going to bend his knee to Jesus. And this one elderly woman, whose name, by the way, was Sylvia, put her arm around Leslie's shoulder and pulled her to the side and said, oh, Leslie, no one is beyond hope. And she gave her a verse from the Old Testament, Ezekiel 36:26, that says, moreover, I will give you a new heart, and I will put a new spirit within you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And what I never knew that whole 2 years that I'm on this investigative journey, what I never knew at the time is my wife, on her own, every day, on her knees, in private, was praying that verse for me. And can I tell you what happened? Starting on that Sunday afternoon, now that I'd received this free gifts of God's grace, and then over time, as I was baptized, as I became part of a vibrant church, as I learned to read the Bible now with fresh eyes, as I learned to pray, as I learned to worship, God began to answer her prayers because my values changed, and my morality changed, and my worldview changed, and my attitudes, and my relationships, and my philosophy, and my priorities, and my parenting, and my marriage. I mean, all these things over time began to change for the good. So much that my little daughter, Allison, remember I told you about my little daughter? She was 5 years old when I came to faith in Christ. All she had known, get this, all she had known the first 5 years of her life was a dad who was absent, angry, kicking holes in walls, coming home drunk. That was her whole life experience. But you know what she did? Starting on that day, she started to watch. Something's changing with my dad. Something's different with my dad. Something's new with my dad. Never interviewed a scholar, never studied archaeology, just 5 years old. But she could listen, she could watch, she could observe, and she did. And it took about 4 or 5 months. And then one Sunday morning, she came up to Leslie. You know what she said? I want God to do for me what he's done for Daddy. And at age 5, she received this free gift of God's grace. She became a child of God, and today she's married to a seminary graduate. She's a novelist. She's had half a dozen novels, books of fiction that have been published, but they all have the gospel woven into them. Her and her husband together write children's books about Jesus. And she is the mother of 2 of my 4 precious grandchildren, and today we're the best of friends. And same with my son. My son saw the difference at a young age in his mom and his dad and his sister, and he came to faith at a young age too, but he took a different route. He took an academic route, got an undergraduate degree in biblical studies, and he got a master's degree in philosophy of religion. Then he got another master's degree in New Testament. And then after many years of research and study at Yale University and at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, he was awarded his PhD in theology. And you know what he does today? He's a professor of theology at one of the largest Christian seminaries in America, the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University, teaching future pastors about Jesus Christ. And 9 years ago, his wife gave birth to our first grandson. And he named him after me. Friends, God rescued our family. He changed my son, he changed my daughter, he changed my wife, and now my wife and I just celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary together. So that's my story. That's my story.
Isn't it amazing to see how people can be changed by a relationship with Jesus Christ? What a great outcome for the Strobel family, right down to their grandchildren. And you know, I always love it when biblical accounts are backed up by sources outside of the Bible, and Lee did such a great job sharing some of those today. And if you're wishing you could explain this content to a friend the way Lee just did, don't worry. It's all in his little book, The Case for Easter, and we'll send that out to you for a donation of any amount as you support the ministry of Focus on the Family. You might not know this, but in the past year, almost 800 people a day have dedicated or rededicated their lives to Jesus Christ through Focus on the Family. And you know what? That's the most important thing we could do here at Focus. So please donate if you can so that we can reach even more families for Jesus.
And you can get your copy of The Case for Easter when you follow the link in the description below. And please hit subscribe so you can access more videos like this and see the latest that we have for you. Leave a comment as well to tell us what you think of today's program. That'll encourage others. And thanks for watching Focus on the Family with Jim Daly. I'm John Fuller, inviting you back as we once more help you and your family thrive in Christ.